Adelaide Bishop stepped off the westbound train at Harrow Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1884 with a single trunk, $23 folded inside her boot, and a grief so heavy it had bent the shape of her entirely. She had not always been a woman who carried such weight. There had been a time, not so very long ago, when she had been the kind of person who laughed easily, who kept a kitchen garden with more enthusiasm than skill, who sang to herself while she pinned laundry to the line behind the small house in Ohio she had shared with her husband, Thomas, and their daughter, Clara. That time felt now like something she had read in a book rather than lived through herself. It felt like another woman's story, belonging to another woman's body, and Adelaide had not yet figured out how to reconcile the person she had been with the hollow thing she had become. Thomas had gone first, taken by a fever in the January of 1883 that had swept through their township with a particular cruelty. He had been 31 years old and strong as an ox, or so everyone had said at his funeral, as though his strength had been a personal betrayal when it failed him. Adelaide had nursed him for 9 days without sleeping more than an hour at a stretch, and on the 10th morning she had woken to find the bed beside her gone cold. She had lain there for a long while before she called for the doctor, because some part of her had not wanted the world to know yet, had wanted to keep it private just a little longer, the way you press your palm over a wound before you finally show someone how bad it truly is. Clara had lasted 4 more months. She had been 8 years old, and the same fever that had taken her father had left something behind in her lungs, a weakness that the town doctor had called consumption, and that Adelaide had called unfair, because she could not call it what it really was, which was unbearable. Clara had died on a Tuesday afternoon in May while Adelaide sat beside her reading from a book of fairy tales, and Adelaide had kept reading for some time after, her voice going on steadily even as her world came apart at its foundation. By the time the year had turned and spring had come again, Adelaide had understood that she could not stay in Ohio. She could not keep walking past the church where they had been married, past the school where Clara had been enrolled for 1 short year, past the graves in the churchyard that bore names she loved. She was 28 years old, and she had already buried everything she had built. She needed to go somewhere that held none of her history, somewhere the land itself would not remind her of what she had lost. She had answered an advertisement in a Kansas City newspaper that called for a schoolteacher to serve the small mining and ranching community of Harrow Creek, Colorado. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Reverend Aldous Marsh, who oversaw the small church there, and had apparently taken it upon himself to also oversee the education of the territory's children. The position paid a modest wage, offered a room at the widow Calloway's boarding house, and required only that the applicant possess a firm command of arithmetic, reading, and letters. Adelaide had all of these things and not much else, and so she had written back, and Reverend Marsh had written again to say she was hired, and 6 weeks later she found herself standing on a raw wooden platform in a town she had never seen, breathing air that tasted like pine and iron and distance. Harrow Creek was not beautiful, not in the way she had imagined the West might be. It was rougher than that, more honest in its ugliness, a scatter of buildings along a wide dirt street that turned to mud when it rained and to a choking, pale dust when it did not. There was a general store, a saloon with a painted sign that had begun to peel at the corners, a blacksmith's forge that breathed heat into the air even from 50 yards away, a small bank, and the white-painted church that Reverend Marsh kept with obvious pride. The mountains rose behind all of it in jagged blue lines, enormous and indifferent, and the sky above them was a color Adelaide had no adequate word for, a shade somewhere between blue and something older. She found the boarding house without much difficulty, because Harrow Creek was not large enough to lose yourself in, and the widow Calloway, a compact woman of about 50 with sharp gray eyes and an apron she apparently never removed, received her with a kind of brisk efficiency that Adelaide found more comforting than she might have expected. "You'll be the schoolteacher," Mrs. Calloway said, leading her up a narrow staircase without waiting for confirmation. "Your room is at the end. Window faces east, so you'll have the morning light. Breakfast is at 6, supper at 7. I do not serve midday meals. There is a wash basin and a pitcher, and I fill the pitcher each morning. If you need it filled again, you fill it yourself from the pump in the yard." "Thank you," Adelaide said. "The Reverend says you've come from Ohio." "I have." Mrs. Calloway paused at the door of the room and looked at her with those sharp eyes. "People come west for all sorts of reasons," she said, and it was not quite a question. "They do," Adelaide agreed, and Mrs. Calloway seemed to understand that this was as much as she was going to get, because she nodded and left Adelaide alone in the small, clean room with its iron bed, and its east-facing window, and its view of the mountains going purple in the late afternoon light. Adelaide sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for a while. She had made it. She had gotten here. She was not sure yet what that was worth, but she had done it, and she was still breathing, and sometimes that had to be enough. She met Oliver Donovan 3 days later, and the meeting was not romantic by any measure. It was, in fact, an argument. She had been setting up the schoolroom, which occupied the back half of the church building, arranging the few desks that existed, and making a list of the supplies she would need, when a man appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that suggested he had come to deliver unwelcome news, but had not yet worked out the kindest way to do it. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered cedar, a brown that was also somehow green, or perhaps a green that was also somehow brown. He was lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, all functional muscle and no softness, and his hands when he turned his hat were broad and scarred in the small ways that came from working with rope and wood and iron over many years. He was maybe 32 or 33, she thought, though the sun had put lines at the corners of his eyes that made him harder to place. He was not a man who wore his age easily on his face. He wore it instead like something he had learned to carry without drawing attention to the weight. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. It came out flatter than she suspected he intended. "I am," she said, "Adelaide Bishop, and you are Oliver Donovan. I run the Double D spread about 4 miles east of town. I've got 2 boys who will be coming to your school." "That's good to hear," she said, because it was. The Reverend had told her she might expect between 8 and 12 students of varying ages, and every one of them was important. Oliver Donovan turned his hat another quarter turn in his hands. "I want them to learn to read properly and to do figures. That's what matters for running land. Reading and arithmetic are the foundation of everything," Adelaide agreed pleasantly, "so we are in complete agreement." He looked at her as though he had expected more resistance. "I also want you to know that I don't hold with keeping children inside at a desk when there's real work to be done. There are times of year when I'll need them home." And there it was. She looked at him levelly. "Mr. Donovan, I understand that this is a working community, and I have no intention of being unreasonable about seasonal demands. But I would ask that you give me fair notice before keeping your sons home, and I would ask that this not become a habit throughout the year, because an education interrupted so frequently that it cannot accumulate is no education at all." He looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly longer than was comfortable. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to respect. "Fair enough," he said. "Good. What are your boys' names?" "James, he's 11. "And Samuel, who's 8. "They'll start Monday, I presume." "They'll start Monday," he confirmed and put his hat back on and left. Adelaide watched him go and thought that he was a man accustomed to being the most certain person in any room, and that it seemed to inconvenience him slightly that she had not been intimidated by him. She found this mildly entertaining, which surprised her, because very little had managed to be entertaining recently. Monday came, and with it 9 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, including James Donovan, who had his father's cedar-colored eyes and a kind of watchful stillness that reminded her sharply of him, and Samuel Donovan, who had a gap in his front teeth and an irrepressible willingness to ask questions about everything, which Adelaide immediately loved about him. The school day went well enough. She assessed where each child was in their learning, assigned them to appropriate work, and discovered in the process that several of them were behind where she would have hoped, partly from inconsistent schooling and partly simply from the fact that there was always something else pressing in this country, always something that demanded priority over sitting still with a book. She was not discouraged. She had expected this. What she had not expected was that Oliver Donovan himself would come to collect his sons that first afternoon, arriving just as she was washing the chalk from the small blackboard she had found propped against the back wall. He stood in the doorway again, and she wondered if he was the kind of man who always preferred to keep a door at his back. "How did they do?" he asked. She told him honestly. James was strong in arithmetic and behind in his letters. Samuel was the opposite, reading well beyond his age but struggling with his sums. She would address both deficiencies. Oliver listened to all of this with his arms crossed and his hat still on this time, and when she finished he said, "Thank you for telling me straight. I don't see the use in anything else." He nodded. He seemed about to go and then did not. He said with some effort, as though the words required more physical exertion than they should have, "Their mother died 2 years ago. Fever took her." Adelaide was quiet for a moment because she knew what that sentence weighed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just wanted you to know so you understand why they might be behind. It wasn't for lack of caring." "I never imagined it was," she said. He looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something careful and a little raw, like a man who has said more than he intended and is deciding whether to regret it. "Good night, Miss Bishop," he said. "Good night, Mr. Donovan." He left, and his sons trotted out behind him into the long gold light of a Colorado evening, and Adelaide stood alone in the schoolroom for a long time afterward, thinking about fevers and about the things people carry when they think no one can see the weight. The weeks settled into a rhythm after that. She taught, and the children came, and the mountains watched it all from the distance with their permanent expression of magnificent unconcern. Mrs. Calloway fed her well and asked few questions, which was the best possible arrangement. Reverend Marsh was a kind man with a slight stammer and an enormous library that he had hauled west on a wagon, and that he offered to Adelaide without hesitation, and she spent her evenings reading by lamplight the way other people might drink, as a way of getting through the hours without having to be too present in them. She noticed things, because she was a teacher and observation was her primary instrument. She noticed that Harrow Creek was a town caught between versions of itself, still rough and provisional in many ways but reaching, tentatively, towards something more permanent. She noticed that the saloon was better attended than the church, and that Reverend Marsh had made his peace with this. She noticed that there was an injustice in the way the Mexican families who worked the mines on the edge of town were treated differently in commerce, and in conversation, paid less for identical work, spoken to with a curtness that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with contempt, and she found this deeply troubling. She made a point of welcoming the children from those families into the school without ceremony or distinction, which earned her some raised eyebrows from certain quarters of the town and the quiet, dignified gratitude of the families themselves, which she valued considerably more. She noticed Oliver Donovan, too, more than she wanted to. He came to collect his sons on most days, and on the days he sent his ranch hand, a weathered Mexican man named Ernesto who tipped his hat to her with great courtesy. She found herself checking the road with more attention than the situation strictly required. When Oliver did come, they often talked for a few minutes, standing in the doorway or sometimes, as the days grew longer and warmer, on the wooden step outside. He asked about the boy's progress with a genuine, focused attention that she respected. He asked about her, occasionally, in the sideways way of a man who does not want to seem as interested as he is. She learned things about him in those doorway conversations. He had come west from Missouri at the age of 20, with a little money and a great deal of stubbornness, and had built the Double D from almost nothing over the following decade. He had married a woman named Ruth when he was 24, and she had been 22, and they had had 8 years together before the fever took her in the winter of 1882. He spoke of her rarely, and when he did it was with a restraint that she recognized because she used the same restraint herself, the careful compression of something enormous into the smallest possible space, so that you could take it out and look at it briefly without being destroyed by it. She told him a little about Ohio, about the school she had taught it there before her marriage, about Thomas and Clara without many details, just enough to explain why she was here, alone at 28, starting over in a town full of strangers. He listened to what she said and also, she thought, to what she did not say, and he did not fill her silences with the useless consolations that most people reached for. He just listened, and that was more valuable than he probably knew. One evening in early June, a Tuesday, he arrived later than usual, and the boys were already waiting outside, sitting on the step and throwing pebbles at a fence post with quiet expertise. She was inside, writing the next week's lesson plans in a journal she had bought at the general store, and Oliver appeared in the doorway and said, "Miss Bishop." She looked up. His expression was different tonight. Something in it was less contained. "Ride out to the ranch with me," he said. "I want you to see something." It was a strange invitation, and she was aware that propriety might have required her to decline it. But propriety had always been something she observed as a courtesy to other people's comfort rather than her own conviction. And besides, something in his voice suggested that this was important to him in a way he would not easily articulate. "All right," she said, and set down her pen. He had a second horse, a calm bay mare that he held while Adelaide mounted, and they rode out of town with the boys trotting ahead on their own horses with the natural ease of children who have been riding since they could walk. The land opened up as they left the town behind, and she felt something in her chest expand with it, as though she had been breathing in a small room for weeks and had only now stepped outside. The Double D was a working ranch in every visible sense, no pretension or decoration, just the structures and equipment necessary for the raising of cattle and the survival of the people who tended them. The house was 2 stories, more substantial than she had expected, built from logs and rough timber with a porch that ran the full length of the front. There were 2 barns, a bunkhouse, fenced pastures, and cattle in numbers she could not quickly count spreading across the grassland toward the mountains. But he did not take her to the house. He took her around the east side of it, past a kitchen garden that had been started but not well maintained, and then up a slight rise to a place where a single large cottonwood tree stood at the crest of the hill, its new summer leaves shaking silver and green in the evening breeze. From there the entire valley was visible, the town in the distance, the creek flashing, the mountains on every side, and the sky above it all bleeding from blue to gold to pink as the sun went down behind the western peaks. She was quiet for a long moment. "This is remarkable," she said. "Ruth used to come up here," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I haven't been up here since she died," he said. "I don't know why I brought you." She looked at him. He was watching the mountains rather than her, his jaw set in the way people set their jaws when they are holding something together by force of will. "Maybe you needed company for it," she said quietly. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Maybe." They stood there in the evening light for a long time without saying much more, and it was the most genuine conversation Adelaide had had with anyone since she'd arrived, and neither of them had said very many words at all. She had supper at the ranch that night, which she had not planned on, and it was a good meal that Ernesto's wife, a warm and practical woman named Maria, had made and left on the stove for them. The boys were lively at the table in a way they were not at school, James quieter but with a dry humor that emerged in flashes, Samuel talking almost without pause about a lizard he had found that afternoon and intended to study. Oliver listened to both of them with the particular, unhurried attention of a man who is aware that these moments are the substance of something important and does not want to miss them. Adelaide found herself watching him with the children and thinking that this was the most honest version of a person, the version they were when they were not performing for the world. She rode back to town alone because he offered to escort her and she declined, because she needed the 1.5 miles of open road in the warm dark to think, and because she was beginning to feel things she had not expected to feel, and she was not entirely sure they were welcome. July arrived with a heat that pressed down from a white sky and did not relent, and with it came a series of events that threw the carefully measured rhythm of Adelaide's days into something less ordered. The first was a letter from her sister in Ohio, telling her with gentle concern that their mother's health had declined and asking whether Adelaide might consider coming home. Adelaide read the letter twice and then sat for a long time in her east-facing room looking at the mountains. She had come here specifically to not be there, to not be surrounded by the geography of her grief, and she was not ready to go back. She wrote a careful, loving letter explaining this as well as she could without saying all of it, and sent it with the next stage. The second was trouble at the mining camp on the edge of town, where a dispute over wages had grown into something uglier, and 3 of the Mexican workers had been let go without the pay they were owed by the mine's owner, a man named Horace Fisk, who had the satisfied look of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted from people who had fewer options than he did. Adelaide heard about this from Maria, and it made her angry in the clean, clarifying way that genuine injustice did, the kind of anger that pointed toward action rather than just feeling. She went to see Reverend Marsh, who agreed that the situation was wrong but expressed doubt about what could be done. She went to see the town's small legal representative, a young man named Carter Webb who had read law in Denver and was trying to establish a practice in Harrow Creek, and he listened to her with more attention than she had expected and said he thought there might be grounds for a complaint. She was coming out of Carter Webb's office when she ran, literally, into Oliver Donovan, who caught her by the arm before she could stumble from the impact. "Sorry," she said, finding her footing. He kept his hand on her arm for a moment longer than strictly necessary, then let go. "What's got you moving that fast?" he asked. She told him about the miners. He listened with his arms crossed and his expression shifting from neutral to the particular tightness that she had come to recognize meant he was angry about something and deciding what to do about it. "Fisk's been pulling that kind of thing for 2 years," he said, "and no one has done anything. People have talked. Talking's different from doing." He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to help those men get what they're owed," she said. "Carter Webb thinks there's a legal avenue. Fisk has money and Fisk has friends." "And those men have families," Adelaide said, "and a right to be paid for work they actually did." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go with you to talk to Fisk." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, with a slight edge that she had learned meant he was done discussing whether he was going to do something. "But Fisk respects the Double D if he respects anything, and 2 people making a case are harder to dismiss than 1. They went together to see Fisk the next morning, and it was not a comfortable conversation. Fisk was a broad, florid man with small eyes, who had the manner of someone who had spent decades treating his own convenience as a moral principle. And he looked at Adelaide with the particular dismissiveness some men reserved for women who spoke on subjects he considered beyond their scope. But Oliver was there beside her, saying very little but saying it with a weight and directness that clearly landed, and between Carter Webb's legal argument and Oliver's economic leverage, which came from the fact that the Double D bought significant supply from businesses that were in turn connected to Fisk's operations, they secured a promise of payment. It was not a perfect resolution. Adelaide knew that, but the 3 men got their wages within the week, and that was something. Maria came to find her at the school to tell her, and she pressed Adelaide's hands between both of hers with such warmth that Adelaide had to work to keep her composure. That evening, walking back from the school, she encountered Oliver coming out of the general store with a sack of flour over one shoulder, which he managed with the easy strength of a man who does not think about lifting heavy things because he does it all the time. He saw her and fell into step beside her. "The miners got their pay," she said. "I heard. Thank you for coming with me. It made a difference." "You would have found a way without me," he said. "Maybe, but it would have taken longer." They walked for a little way in the particular comfortable silence that had been developing between them lately, the kind of silence that is not actually silent at all but full of a low, steady hum of mutual ease that is rarer and more valuable than most people recognize. "I want to ask you something," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he had been working up to it. "All right," she said. He was quiet for another moment. They had reached the corner of the main street, where the road forked toward the boarding house and away toward the livery stable. They both stopped without coordinating it. "Would you have supper with me?" he said. "In town, at the hotel dining room, just the two of us." She looked at him. He was looking at the street ahead rather than at her, and she could see the tension in his jaw and suspected that asking for things was not something that came naturally to him, that he had built his entire adult life around a kind of self-sufficiency that made asking feel like a form of exposure. "Yes," she said. "I would." He looked at her then. That not-quite smile that she had begun to look for. "Saturday evening," he said. "Saturday evening," she agreed. She walked the rest of the way to the boarding house with something in her chest that was lighter than anything she had felt in a very long time, and she did not quite know what to do with it. So she set it aside carefully and tried not to examine it too closely, the way you do with something fragile that you are not yet sure will survive the handling. Saturday evening arrived with the particular golden clarity of a Colorado summer night. The sky still bright at 7 in the evening. The mountains turned to copper by the setting sun. Adelaide put on the best dress she had brought with her, a deep blue that had been her favorite before everything, and she looked in the small mirror over the wash basin and thought that she looked more like herself than she had in a year and a half. Not the old self exactly, not the one with the kitchen garden and the singing, but something that might be a new version of self, a woman who had been broken down to the foundation and was building differently the second time. Oliver was waiting at the hotel when she arrived. He had made an effort that was visible and endearing, his dark hair combed, his shirt clean, his boots showing evidence of a recent and unusually thorough polishing. He stood when she came in with the slightly formal courtesy of a man who had been taught good manners long ago and kept them in reserve for occasions that merited them. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you," she said. "You look quite well yourself." The hotel dining room was the most refined establishment in Harrow Creek, which set a particular kind of bar, but the food was good, and the table had a cloth on it, and the candle between them threw warm light that made everything look slightly better than the hard daylight would have permitted. They talked through the meal with an ease that surprised them both, or perhaps surprised only her, since she had not been sure whether the comfort of their doorway conversations would survive the more deliberate context of something that was unambiguously a dinner together. He told her about Missouri, about the family farm he had grown up on, his father who had been a patient and quietly funny man, his mother who had been formidable in the way that women who raise large families often are. He had been the second of 5 children, and had left at 20 because the farm would go to his eldest brother, and he had wanted to make his own ground rather than stand on someone else's. She told him about her own childhood, more than she had told anyone since moving here, about the river that ran behind her family's property in Ohio, about the father who had read to her every evening and made her love books, about the way she had known since she was small that she wanted to teach, that something in the transmission of knowledge from one person to another felt essential to her in a way she could not entirely explain but had never doubted. "You're good at it," he said. "Teaching. How would you know?" She asked, genuinely curious. "James talks about it," he said. "Not much because he's a quiet boy, but when he says something, he means it. He said you explain things in a way that makes them make sense." She felt the warmth of that spread through her chest. "That's the whole job, really," she said, "making it make sense." "Most things don't," he said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted, something quieter and more undefended than his usual register. "Make sense, I mean." She looked at him across the candle. "No," she said, "they don't." A pause settled between them, the particular pause that happens when two people who have both sustained enormous losses recognize that recognition in each other. "Ruth," he said, just the name without the rest of it, and she understood. "Thomas and Clara," she said. Just the names. He looked at her with those cedar-colored eyes across the small table in the candlelight, and she thought she had never felt so comprehensively understood by someone she had known for such a short time. "I didn't expect to want things again," he said quietly. I thought I was probably done with all of that." "I thought the same thing," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, gently, and then withdrew it. A touch like a sentence, something said and then allowed to stand on its own. She lay awake a long time that night in her east-facing room, listening to the sounds of the sleeping town and the wind that came down from the mountains after dark, and she thought about what it meant to want things again. She had come here to outlast her grief. That was the word she had used to herself on the train. Outlast it, as though it were a siege, and if she simply held the walls long enough it would exhaust itself and retreat. She had not come here expecting to find anything new. She had come here expecting to survive. But something was happening anyway, as things sometimes do without permission, growing up through the packed-down earth of a life that thought it was finished, surprising and tentative and real. August was the month that things shifted. The summer had been full and busy, the school term going well by any measure she could apply, the children making progress that pleased her deeply, especially James, whose reading had caught up substantially, and a quiet girl named Petra from one of the Mexican mining families who had turned out to have a gift for mathematics that Adelaide intended to nurture with everything she had. The days were long and warm, and the town had the slightly drowsy, saturated quality of midsummer, everyone moving a little more slowly, the dust a little thicker, the sky a shade paler from the heat. Oliver and Adelaide had developed something that was not yet fully named, but that both of them were aware of. He brought the boys most mornings now, not just some evenings. They had shared 3 more meals together, 2 at the hotel and one that had happened more or less naturally one Sunday when she had been walking in the countryside east of town and had encountered him mending a fence line near the road, and he had offered her water from his canteen. And then, without either of them making a formal decision about it, they had sat on a flat rock in the shade of a juniper and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. And it had been one of the best afternoons she could remember in years. He was not a man who said romantic things easily. He was not constructed that way, and she did not want him to be constructed differently, because the directness and the economy of him were part of what she valued. But he showed what he felt in other ways, the kind of ways that require more consistent effort than words and therefore mean more. He brought her a book from the general store in Denver when Ernesto made a supply run there, a collection of essays on natural history that she had mentioned once in passing she had always wanted to read. He repaired the broken latch on the schoolroom window without being asked and without mentioning it. When she told him she was struggling with getting enough chalk and a proper globe for the classroom, he made a contribution to the school's limited funds that she discovered only when Reverend Marsh mentioned it with obvious approval. She was teaching on a Wednesday afternoon in late August when she heard shouting from the direction of the main street, followed by the kind of running footsteps that meant something had happened outside the ordinary range of events. She told the children to stay in their seats, which several of them immediately failed to do, and went to the door. There had been a horse thrown on the main street, a big roan that had come down badly and taken its rider with it. The rider was conscious but clearly injured, and Adelaide recognized him with a lurch of her stomach as Ernesto, who had apparently been coming back from an errand on a borrowed horse that had spooked at something and come down on the loose stones at the edge of the road. She went to him quickly, because she had some practical knowledge of injury from her years of nursing Thomas, and she could see that his right leg was badly hurt, possibly broken. She organized the gathering crowd into usefulness with the efficient authority of a schoolteacher who has had to manage chaos regularly, directing 2 men to hold the horse and 2 more to help move Ernesto carefully out of the road. The town did not have a doctor. The nearest physician was in Raleigh, 30 miles away. There was a woman named Della Hooper who had some knowledge of medicinal herbs and practical nursing, and Adelaide sent someone for her immediately while she knelt in the dust beside Ernesto and held his hand and talked to him quietly in the way she had learned to talk to people who were frightened and in pain, steadily and without alarm, simply marking that she was there and that things were being managed. Oliver arrived at a gallop within the hour, someone having ridden out to the Double D to tell him. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and came straight to where Ernesto was lying on a pallet in the shade, now splinted by Della Hooper's capable hands and dosed with willow bark tea. The relief on Oliver's face when he saw that Ernesto was conscious and stable was immediate and unguarded. He crouched beside the older man and spoke to him in Spanish, which Adelaide had not known he could do, and the conversation between them was quiet and carried the texture of 2 people who have worked beside each other for long enough that formality has long since been replaced by something warmer and more honest. He looked up eventually and found her face across the room. "Thank you," he said. "Maria told me you were the first one to help him." "Of course," she said. Ernesto's leg was indeed broken, and he would be laid up for 6 weeks at minimum. Oliver brought him and Maria to stay at the ranch house, where Maria could look after him without having to navigate the distance to and from the mining camp. He managed this with the kind of practical care that she had come to associate with him, no fuss or announcement, just the doing of the thing. It was that same evening, sitting on the porch of the boarding house as the sun went down, that Adelaide let herself think clearly about what she felt, because she had been carefully not thinking about it clearly, and that strategy had reached its limit. She was in love with Oliver Donovan. Not the beginning of love, not the uncertain flutter of attraction, but the steadier and more substantial thing, the kind that wants not just the person's company but their well-being, the kind that sees them clearly and wants them anyway, the kind that feels like recognition rather than discovery. She was frightened of it. That was the honest truth. She had been in love before, had loved Thomas with her whole heart, and she had learned what it meant to lose that. She knew what the cost was. She knew the precise shape of the crater it left. And some part of her, the part that had been managing the siege of grief for 18 months, said very quietly that it would be safer not to do this again. But another part of her, older and less governed by caution, said that safety was not a life, and that Thomas himself, who had been a generous and clear-eyed man, would not have wanted the walls to stay up forever. She was still sitting there thinking, when she heard boots on the step and looked up to find Oliver standing at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. He looked, she thought, like a man who has prepared a speech and already knows he is not going to give it. He sat down on the step, not beside her, not quite yet. On the step below the chair she was in, which put him at a slight angle, and he looked out at the road rather than at her. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked, though she had a sense of it. "About what I want," he said carefully, "which is something I told myself I was finished wanting." She was quiet, because she recognized this sentence. She had thought it herself not 2 hours ago, on this same porch. "I've been thinking about the fact that you are the first person in 2 years who I have looked forward to seeing," he said, in the measured, deliberate way of a man choosing each word individually and with purpose, "and that your voice is the one I want to tell things to." And that when I'm up at that cottonwood tree, which I've been going to again since you came with me that first time, I want you there beside me." He stopped. He was looking at the street, and in the fading evening light she could see that this had cost him something, the saying of it. "Oliver," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I feel the same way," she said. "All of it." The expression that moved across his face then was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, relief and hope and something that was unmistakably joy, arriving all at once and all the more powerful for having been held back so long. "I should tell you that I'm not a man who says things prettily," he said. "I've noticed," she said, and could not keep the warmth entirely out of her voice. "And I am not always easy to live alongside," he said. "I've been told I'm stubborn." "I am also stubborn," she said. "We can be stubborn together." That broke through the last of his reserve, and he laughed, a real laugh that she had heard only a handful of times, and that she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. He reached up and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over so that her palm met his, and they sat like that as the sky went dark and the first stars appeared above the mountains. September brought the beginning of autumn, the aspens on the mountain slopes turning to gold, the air sharpening at night to something that carried the first clean edge of cold. It was Adelaide's favorite time of year, had always been, and in the West it was more dramatic and more beautiful than anything she had seen in Ohio. The gold of the aspens so vivid it looked lit from within, the sky above them a blue so deep it was almost violet. She and Oliver were, as the town had begun to understand without anyone formally declaring it, together. It had not been announced, but it was visible in the particular way of small communities, where visibility is almost impossible to avoid, and the reactions had ranged from Mrs. Calloway's brief, satisfied nod to Reverend Marsh's undisguised delight to one or two more skeptical assessments, from people who thought a schoolteacher ought not to be keeping company with a rancher, though the precise nature of their objection was never quite clear. None of this particularly concerned Adelaide. She had never been someone who made her decisions based on the comfort of observers. The boys had absorbed the change with the practical adaptability of children who are fundamentally secure. Samuel had been the more openly enthusiastic, asking Adelaide one morning as she was starting the school day whether she liked his father, and then, when she had said yes, informing her that his father liked her too because he was different when she was around. James had been quieter about it, which she had expected, and she had been careful with him, not rushing anything, letting him move toward her at his own pace. One afternoon he had stayed after the other children left and helped her straighten the classroom without being asked, and when they were done he had said, looking at the floor, "My mother liked learning. She wished she'd had more of it." And Adelaide had understood that this was the most important thing he had said to her, a gift and an opening both. "Would you like to tell me about her?" she said. He looked up. His face, so like his father's, was careful and serious. "She was funny," he said. "People who didn't know her well thought she was quiet, but she was funny." "That sounds like someone worth knowing," Adelaide said. "She was," he said, and nodded once and picked up his school bag and went outside. She watched him go and thought about how love is not a single thing that you hold in place of what is gone. It is additional. It does not require you to erase what came before. It simply takes up the space that is newly available, and if it is real, it does not compete with memory. It coexists with it. October was the month Oliver asked her to marry him. It happened at the cottonwood tree on the hill above the Double D, which felt right in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not been there the first time. It was a Sunday afternoon, the valley below them gone russet and gold, the mountains already showing snow on their peaks, the sky doing its autumn performance of cobalt and cloud. He had brought her up here on the premise of showing her how different the valley looked in fall, which was true but not the whole story, as she had suspected from the slightly different quality of his silence during the ride out. He had been building toward something all afternoon in the way that he built toward things, without fanfare, with a steady, purposeful accumulation of intention. They stood under the cottonwood tree, which had gone entirely gold, its leaves shaking in the light wind with a sound like distant water. And he turned to face her and took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with those eyes that had been weathered and honest from the first moment she had seen them. "Adelaide," he said, "I want to ask you something." "I know," she said softly. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "I want to build something with you, the ranch, the boys, a life that is larger and better for having you in it." He paused and then added with the directness that was so essentially him, "I love you. I have been trying not to say it because saying things aloud makes them real and real things can be lost, and I know you understand that because you understand most things without being told. But I want to say it because you deserve to hear it plainly. I love you, Adelaide Bishop." She felt the tears before she was aware of making any decision to cry, not grief tears, not the kind she had spent the last 2 years fighting back, but the other kind, the kind that come from the chest expanding past its usual dimensions. "I love you too," she said. "Oliver, yes, yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his arms close around her in a hold that was both certain and gentle, and she thought that this was what it felt like to have a foundation again. Not the same as before, different, built from different materials on different ground, but solid. They stood together under the gold tree with the whole valley spread below them, and the mountains watching with their magnificent, indifferent permanence, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a long while. They married in December, a month after Adelaide had written to her sister in Ohio with news that she was not coming back, at least not in the way her sister had meant, because she had a life here now that she intended to keep. Her sister had written back with a great deal of warmth, and a declaration that she intended to visit in the spring, which Adelaide looked forward to very much. The wedding was held in Reverend Marsh's church on a Saturday, and if Harrow Creek had ever attended a wedding with more collective investment in the outcome, Adelaide did not know when it might have been. The church was full, every pew taken and people standing along the back wall, because the town had absorbed this story, two people shaped and reshaped by loss who had found each other across a schoolroom doorway, and it gave them something to believe in, which is not nothing in a place and a time that requires as much faith as the wild frontier demands. Mrs. Calloway sat in the front row and wept with complete composure, which was typical of her. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with his slight stammer and enormous joy. Ernesto and Maria were there, Ernesto upright now and walking, though still favoring his mended leg. Petra from the mining family was there with her parents, and she gave Adelaide a wildflower wreath that she had made herself, which Adelaide wore over her gathered hair, and which pleased her more than any more formal decoration would have done. James stood beside his father, very straight and serious, with the cedar-colored eyes and the quiet dignity that would someday make him a formidable man. Samuel stood on the other side and grinned throughout the entire ceremony with the unsuppressible joy of someone for whom the present moment is entirely satisfactory. Adelaide walked down the short aisle in the blue dress she had worn to their first dinner, which she had made do and carefully pressed, with no one to give her away, because she did not need to be given. She was a woman who had come to this place under her own power and was staying under her own power, and the man waiting for her at the front of the church understood this and loved her for it, and that was the whole of the arrangement. Oliver watched her come toward him with an expression that she thought she would spend years learning to fully read, because it was very full, and he was not a man who let things show easily, and the fact that so much was visible on his face right now was in itself a measure of how thoroughly he meant all of this. When Reverend Marsh asked if she took this man, she said yes, as though she had never meant any single word more completely. When Oliver said his own yes, his voice was low and steady and entirely certain, the voice of a man who does not make promises lightly and will not break them lightly either. He kissed her with the gathered warmth of all the months of careful, building feeling, and Harrow Creek made a noise of the kind that communities make when they are, collectively, deeply satisfied. Winter at the Double D was a different world from the town. Quieter, larger, the land becoming something austere and absolute under the snow. Adelaide had moved into the ranch house with the same practical approach she brought to everything, and she had taken it over by degrees, not replacing what was there but adding herself to it. The books that came in with every supply run, the small clay pot of dried herbs on the kitchen windowsill, the lesson plans spread on the table in the evenings, the voice of her talking to the boys about what they were reading. She wrote to her sister regularly now, full letters with real things in them, and she had started the kitchen garden that Oliver kept meaning to maintain but never quite managed, planning it in February so that she would know what to plant in April. She had persuaded Oliver to build a small shelf along the north wall of the main room for books, which he had done on a Sunday, while Samuel handed him nails and James made a show of reading, but kept looking up to watch his father work. And she had kept teaching. She was not going to stop teaching. She had been clear about this before they married, and Oliver had been clear that he expected nothing less. And this was one of the many ways in which they matched each other well, in the mutual assumption that a person's work was part of who they were, and therefore not a negotiating point. Petra's mathematical ability had blossomed over the autumn term into something that Adelaide felt genuine excitement about, and she had written on Petra's behalf to the school superintendent in Denver, asking whether there were pathways for exceptional students in the territory's emerging education system. She had not yet had a reply, but she intended to keep writing until she did, because that was how she operated. By March, the snow was retreating from the valley floor, though the mountains held it still, and the first suggestions of green were appearing in the south-facing slopes. Adelaide was making biscuits in the kitchen one morning, the boys not yet awake, when Oliver came in from the early chores and stopped in the doorway the way he had stopped in so many doorways in the time she had known him, and she looked up and found him watching her with that expression she had been learning for months now. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking that it's good to come home to something." She looked at him across the kitchen, flour on her hands, the stove throwing warmth into the cold morning air, and felt the completeness of the moment with something that was not quite sharp enough to be pain and not quite soft enough to be simple contentment. It was more complex than either of those things. It was the feeling of a life that has been broken and mended, and is now, in its mended form, something she loves perhaps more carefully and more consciously than she could have loved it before, because she knows what it costs. "It is," she said, "very good." He came in from the doorway and kissed her on the top of her head with the easy, undemonstrative tenderness that was his particular style of affection, and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, and sat down at the table to look through the work orders for the day. And she finished the biscuits, and the morning went on around them with the particular ordinary beauty of a life that is actually working. Spring brought Adelaide's sister, whose name was Helen, on the westbound train in April, and Helen arrived in Harrow Creek with 3 trunks and an expression of determined cheerfulness that Adelaide recognized as her sister's standard approach to things she was not sure about. She had never been west before, and the rawness of the landscape clearly required some internal adjustment, but Helen was not a woman who failed to adjust. She stayed for 3 weeks, and by the end of the first week she had thoroughly charmed both Samuel, who was easy to charm, and James, who was not but who seemed to find Helen's straightforward and interested manner comfortable enough to relax around. She had liked Oliver from the first handshake, had told Adelaide privately that he was exactly what she had hoped and nothing she had feared, and had spent one afternoon with Adelaide alone, walking along the creek east of the ranch, talking about Thomas and Clara with the freedom that comes from speaking to someone who had loved them too. "You seem like yourself again," Helen said. "Not the same, but yourself." "I think that's right," Adelaide said. "Thomas would want this for you," Helen said. "You know that." "I know that," Adelaide said. I've known it for a while. Helen went home in May with 3 trunks and a considerably improved opinion of the West in general, and of Harrow Creek in particular, and she and Adelaide continued their regular correspondence, which now had real things in it on both sides. The summer of 1885 was the summer that Adelaide and Oliver's first child was born, a boy they named Daniel, in August, and the event reorganized everything in the particular way that new life always does, sweeping through the existing order and rearranging it around itself with no interest in prior plans or expectations. Daniel was a loud and energetic baby with a great deal of hair, and an expression that Oliver claimed was exactly like Adelaide's when she was making a point she considered obvious. Adelaide said this was not possible, that babies did not make that expression. Oliver maintained that this one did. James and Samuel received their new brother with rather different modes of enthusiasm. Samuel with immediate and unstoppable vocal celebration, and James with a careful, focused attention that looked a great deal like protectiveness. James held Daniel on the second day with the meticulous seriousness of a boy who understands that this is important and wants to do it right. And when Daniel looked up at him with the unfocused gaze of newborns, James said quietly, "Hello, I'm your brother James." And it was the most words she had heard from him at one time about anything emotional, and she had to look away so he did not see her face. Oliver's response to Daniel was a revelation in its own way. She had known he was a good father from watching him with the older boys, but there was something about watching him with a newborn. The way he held Daniel with those big scarred hands so gently and so securely. The way he talked to the baby in a low voice when he thought she was asleep, telling him about the ranch, about the mountains, about the cattle, narrating the world into being for this new person who had arrived in it, that reached past all of her already substantial feelings and found something even deeper. Harrow Creek itself had grown some, as towns do when they catch on, when the combination of a mining economy and ranch land and enough small businesses creates the critical mass of a place that is actually going to last. There was a proper doctor now, a young man named Harlow who had trained in St. Louis, and had come west for reasons he kept to himself, though Adelaide suspected they involved some combination of idealism and difficulty, which she recognized as a common Western motivation. There was a second saloon, which Reverend Marsh regretted but had accepted as inevitable. There was a telegraph office. There was talk of a proper school building, separate from the church, and Adelaide was driving that conversation with the cheerful relentlessness that she brought to anything she believed in. And Oliver had committed to donating lumber from a section of the Double D's timber resources, which had considerably accelerated the fundraising. Petra had received a letter from the Denver superintendent's office, written partly in response to Adelaide's campaign on her behalf, acknowledging her mathematical aptitude and offering a place in a program for advanced students that would begin in the fall. The letter had been read aloud in the schoolroom, and the moment when Petra had understood what it meant, the slow arrival of comprehension on her face followed by a joy so large it seemed to surprise even her, was one of the finest moments Adelaide had had in a teaching life that had accumulated many fine moments. She had gone home from school that day and told Oliver about it, sitting on the porch in the summer warmth with Daniel in her arms, and his expression as she described Petra's face had been everything she needed it to be. "You did that," he said. "Petra did that," she said. "I just held a door open." "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." The years after Daniel's birth were good years, the kind of years that a person looks back on later and names as the time when things were right. They were not without difficulty. There was a drought in 1886 that dried the creek to a trickle and required Oliver to make hard decisions about the cattle and about expenditure that kept him quiet and tense through several months. And Adelaide had learned that the best thing she could do in those stretches was not to push at the tension, but to stay steady beside it, to be the constant thing when everything else felt uncertain. She told him this once, that she was not going anywhere, that a bad year on the ranch did not change anything fundamental, and he had looked at her with such naked gratitude that she had had to remind herself not to be surprised by how much simple consistency means to a person who has lost things unexpectedly. James turned 13 in that drought year, and then 15, and then, by the time Adelaide stopped counting them in quick succession, 17, and he was growing into exactly the man she had suspected he would be, quiet and competent and dry-humored, responsible with the cattle in a way that was beginning to lift real weight from Oliver's shoulders. His relationship with Adelaide had grown slowly, and at his own pace, into something warm and genuine, not what it might have been with a mother from birth, but something that had its own character and its own integrity, built conversation by conversation over the years. Samuel turned 16 in 1887 and announced that he wanted to study law, which made Adelaide burst into a smile because she thought of Carter Webb and the conversation in his office that had somehow been the beginning of everything, and which made Oliver look slightly stunned for a moment before he squared his shoulders, and said that if his son wanted to study law, then they would find a way to make that happen. The school building was completed in the spring of 1887, a proper frame building with 6 windows and a real wooden floor and enough desks for 30 students, and Harrow Creek dedicated it on a Saturday with the town gathered in its entirety and Reverend Marsh making a speech that went considerably longer than anyone had anticipated, and that everyone was content to listen to because the occasion warranted it. Adelaide stood at the front of the new building's main room, looking out at the rows of faces, at Oliver standing in the back with Daniel on his shoulders because Daniel, who was almost 2, had decided that being carried by his father was the correct mode of attendance at public events, and she felt something that she thought she had perhaps not let herself feel completely until this moment, which was that she was home, not returned to a home, not back somewhere familiar. Home in the way you can only be home to a place you chose, a place you came to as a stranger and made yours through work and time and love. She had come to outlast her grief. That had been the plan, the only plan, a simple matter of survival in new geography. She had not expected to build something. She had not expected to find a man who was himself in the business of outlasting grief, who had been holding his walls for 2 years before she arrived, and had been so careful and so private about it that the town had largely believed he was simply a stoic man by nature rather than a man who was quietly managing an enormous loss. They had outlasted it together, which was different from outlasting it alone, better. Not because the losses were undone, because they never were, Thomas and Clara and Ruth still present in the particular absence-shaped way of people who have been loved and are gone. But the grief had changed its shape. It had become something she could look at without being crushed by it, something that belonged to her past and informed her present without governing it. She had a husband she loved with a clarity and completeness that surprised her sometimes still, a daily renewal of something she had not been certain she would ever have again. She had 2 stepsons whom she loved as fiercely as if they had been born to her, one of them already a young man making his own choices, one of them somewhere in the complicated middle space of 16 and full of possibility. She had a son named Daniel who was building himself from the inside out with tremendous energy and absolute confidence that the world was fundamentally good, which she intended to protect for as long as it was in her power to do so. She had a school, and she had a valley, and she had a cottonwood tree on a hill above a ranch where the leaves went gold every October. The spring of 1888 brought good rains and a calf crop that made Oliver come in from the morning rounds with a look on his face that was the rancher's equivalent of joy. And it brought a letter from Petra, now in her 2nd year in Denver, and doing work that made her mathematics teacher write separately to Adelaide in terms of genuine awe. And it brought, in April, the news that Adelaide was carrying another child, which she told Oliver on a Sunday afternoon at the cottonwood tree, because where else would she tell him something like that? He stared at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in the grass at the foot of the tree with the abruptness of a man whose legs have taken an executive decision, and she sat down beside him, and he took her face in his hands and looked at her with those eyes that she had spent 4 years learning and still found full of things she had not yet read. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Adelaide," he said, and could not seem to find what came after her name, which was not usual for him. He was a man who found words when he needed them, but apparently this was beyond the reach of what words were adequate for. "I know," she said. He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, and the mountains watched and the cottonwood tree shook its spring-green leaves overhead, and the valley below them was as beautiful as it had ever been. The second child, born in October of 1888, was another boy, which made Samuel declare the score unfair and Daniel look confused but untroubled by the whole affair. They named him William, after Oliver's father, and he arrived in the world with a particular calm thoroughness that suggested he had thought about it carefully beforehand and decided he was prepared. He had Adelaide's coloring, lighter than Daniel, with gray eyes that Oliver said would change color and Adelaide suspected would not. He was wrong. William kept the gray eyes. They became a family of the particular Colorado kind, shaped by the land and by the weather, and by the work that the land and weather required, but also shaped by the books that occupied the shelves Oliver had built in every room over the years, by the conversations at the supper table that ranged from cattle prices to ancient history, to the progress of the statehood debates in Harrow Creek's small but vigorous political community, by the education that Adelaide continued to regard as the most important project she had ever undertaken. James married at 21, a young woman named Clara who had come to Harrow Creek with her family the previous year, and who had the same kind of quiet depth that James had, the two of them fitting together with the satisfying precision of things that are correctly matched. Adelaide loved her immediately and fiercely, and when James told her privately that he had named the marriage date in part because he wanted her blessing, she had given it with her whole heart and tried very hard not to embarrass him by crying, which she mostly managed. Samuel went to Denver in 1891 to begin his legal studies at 20, and wrote letters home with a frequency and enthusiasm that Oliver pretended to find excessive, but that Adelaide knew. He read immediately upon arrival, and then left on the kitchen table so she could read them too. Harrow Creek, by 1892, had grown into something that could reasonably be called a proper town rather than a provisional outpost. It had a hotel with 6 rooms, a doctor who had been joined by a second, younger doctor who had come out from the East with his wife and 2 children. It had a newspaper that published every Thursday with more optimism than news to fill its 4 pages, but was improving steadily. It had the school that Adelaide had fought for and continued to run, now with an assistant teacher, a young woman named Nora who had grown up in Harrow Creek, and whom Adelaide had taught and watched develop, and eventually recruited back into the schoolroom. She was 36 years old, which felt different than she had expected 36 to feel, fuller somehow, more grounded, less like a number and more like a place she had actually arrived at. She had gray in her hair now at the temples, which Oliver had pointed out one morning with an expression of such uncomplicated affection that she had burst out laughing and told him he had no room to talk, given the situation at his own temples. He had laughed too. She had collected that laugh in all its forms over the years and still felt the warmth of it every time. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house one evening in October, a Thursday, the boys all asleep, the night air carrying the cold that came down from the mountains after dark and that smelled, to Adelaide, permanently like the first week she had been here, like pine and distance and possibility. Daniel was 7, and William was 4, and James and his Clara were expecting their first child in December. Oliver put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, which she had learned was the exact right shape for her to lean against, the way one learns over years of doing something that a particular form is the correct one. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that, because she was thinking a great many things. About the first time she had stepped off the train in Harrow Creek with her single trunk and her folded money and her grief. About a Tuesday afternoon in Ohio when a fairy tale had gone on without an audience. About a cottonwood tree and a man who had stood looking at the mountains and been unable to look at her. "I'm thinking that things turn out differently than you expect," she said. "Better or worse?" She looked up at him. In the lamplight from the window behind them, his face was exactly as familiar to her as the mountains, those lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular way he held his jaw, the cedar-colored depth of his eyes that she had been reading for 8 years and that still, regularly, contained things she was discovering for the first time. "Better," she said. "Considerably better." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Good," he said. "That's what I want for you." "For us," she said. He considered this. Then he said, in the exact tone of a man who means a simple sentence with his entire life, "For us." The mountains held the last of the October light, gold fading to gray, fading to the deep velvet dark of a Colorado night. The creek murmured somewhere in the distance. The cattle shifted in the pastures. The ranch house breathed around them with the warmth of small children sleeping, and a kitchen that had fed many people and a family that had been built, like all the best things, from need and courage, and the willingness of 2 people to stop outlasting their grief alone and start building something in its place. Adelaide Bishop, who had become Adelaide Donovan on a December day in 1884 and who would always be both, closed her eyes briefly and felt the weight of Oliver's arm across her shoulders and the cold mountain air on her face and the good, ordinary realness of a life that had surprised her. And she was not sad, and she was not afraid, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had come west to outlast her grief. She had found, instead, a reason to live forward. And the man beside her, who had been trying to outlast his own grief through 2 long silent years before she arrived, had found in her the same thing, and they had made from that finding everything that mattered, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and the mountains watched it all with their ancient, patient approval, and the cottonwood tree on the hill went gold every October, and the valley held them, and the years were good.